April 5, 1943, the South Pacific. 2:15 a.m. in the morning. Pitch black darkness. The kind of darkness that eats light. In the middle of the ocean, two steel predators are hurtling toward each other at a combined speed of 40 knots. One is the USS O'Bannon, the most decorated destroyer in the American fleet, a ship built for slaughter. The other is the Ro-34, a Japanese submarine hunter-killer surfaced and charging through the waves like a knife. Within seconds, a mistake is made. A command is screamed. And suddenly, these two war machines are not miles apart. They are not yards apart. They are side by side. Too close for torpedoes. Too close for the massive deck guns. The American sailors look down and freeze. The Japanese sailors look up and scramble for their machine gun. It is a standoff that should end in a massacre. The Americans have no time to reload. They have no hand grenades. They have no sidearms ready. They are staring death in the face. But they do have something else. Something sitting in a crate on the deck. Something that military history would later classify as improvised ordnance. But you and I know it by a different name. They grabbed potatoes. This is the true story of the most bizarre kill in World War II. The night a billion-dollar warship was defeated by a vegetable. To understand why a group of elite American sailors started throwing food at a submarine, you have to understand where they were. They were in hell. Officially, it was called the Solomon Islands Campaign, but the men who fought there had a different name for the stretch of water between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. They called it Iron Bottom Sound. Why? Because the floor of that ocean was paved with the rusting hulls of 50 Allied and Japanese warships. By 1943, the Pacific War had turned into a brutal, grinding knife fight in the dark. The Japanese Navy owned the night. They had the Tokyo Express, fast destroyers and submarines that would race down the slot, deliver troops, bombard American positions, and vanish before dawn. The Japanese had better night optics. They had the Long Lance torpedo, a weapon so terrifying it could blow a ship in half before you even knew the enemy was there. American sailors operating in the slot lived in a state of permanent, vibrating terror. You didn't sleep. You napped with one eye open, listening for the sonar ping, waiting for the torpedo wake that signaled your end. Every shadow on the water was a monster. Every splash was a depth charge. And in the middle of this graveyard, patrolling the bloodiest waters on Earth, was a Fletcher-class destroyer with the hull number 450, the USS O'Bannon. She wasn't just a ship. She was a legend in the making. The crew called her the Lucky O, not because she avoided combat, but because she sought it out, and somehow, miraculously, always survived. But luck runs out. And on a moonless night in April, the Lucky O was about to run into something that luck couldn't fix. Let's look at the men inside the steel beast. Commanding the O'Bannon was Commander Donald MacDonald, a man with a name like a nursery rhyme, but a reputation like a razor blade. He was sharp, aggressive, and he drilled his crew until they could fire their 5-inch guns in their sleep. The crew of the O'Bannon were battle-hardened. They had already survived the naval battle of Guadalcanal. They had seen their sister ships explode. They had seen the water catch fire. They knew that in a destroyer duel, the winner isn't the one with the biggest gun. It's the one who shoots first. Speed is life. Hesitation is death. Their ship, the Fletcher-class destroyer, was the pinnacle of 1940s engineering. Top speed of 35 knots. 5 5-inch guns that could hurl a 50-pound shell over 10 miles. 10 torpedo tubes. And racks of depth charges on the stern, designed to crack a submarine's hull like an eggshell. But the Fletcher class had a weakness. A blind spot. Her guns were designed to shoot at ships miles away. They were designed to shoot at planes in the sky. They were massive, heavy mechanisms. They were not designed to shoot at something sitting 5 feet away from the hull. Keep that in mind, because that design flaw is about to become the most important detail in this story. By April 1943, the O'Bannon had been at sea for months. The men were tired. Their uniforms were stained with oil and sweat. They ate standing up. They slept in 4-hour shifts. The psychological strain was immense. In the mess hall, they didn't have much. Fresh food was a luxury. Most of the time, it was powdered eggs and Spam. But every now and then, a supply ship would transfer fresh vegetables, crates of onions, crates of carrots, and, most importantly, crates of tough, brown Idaho potatoes. They were stored in deck lockers, wire bins welded to the side of the ship to keep the vegetables aired out so they wouldn't rot in the tropical heat. Those potatoes were dinner. Nobody, not in their wildest fever dreams, looked at those bins and saw a weapons system. Until the night of April 5th. The O'Bannon is patrolling the darkness southwest of the Solomon Islands. She isn't alone. She's operating with other destroyers, scanning for the Tokyo Express. The sea state is calm. The moon is gone. It is pitch black. Visibility is near zero. On the bridge, Commander MacDonald is watching the radar scope. The green light illuminates his face. The bridge crew speaks in whispers. The radar operator calls out, "Contact. Bearing 210. Range, closing fast. A blip." It wasn't a small fishing boat. It wasn't a wave. It was a solid metallic object, churning through the water on the surface. MacDonald narrows his eyes. American submarines were operating in the area, but they were supposed to be in designated zones. This contact was out of position. "Challenge them," MacDonald orders. The signalman flashes a coded challenge into the darkness. A series of blinks. They wait. No response. Challenge again. Still nothing. The contact is getting bigger on the radar. It's huge, and it's moving fast, MacDonald realizes in a split second. This is an enemy submarine, a Japanese sub running on the surface to recharge its batteries under the cover of darkness. This is the dream target for a destroyer captain. A submarine on the surface is vulnerable. It's a metal coffin waiting to be nailed shut. MacDonald grabs the radio. "All stations! Battle stations! This is not a drill!" The O'Bannon surges forward. The engines roar to life, pushing the ship from a cruise to a sprint. 30 knots, 35 knots. The bow lifts out of the water, cutting through the waves like a serrated blade. The distance closes rapidly. 2 miles, 1 mile, 800 yards. Now they can see it visually. A dark silhouette against the black water. The Row 34. It's a big boat, nearly 250 feet long. MacDonald makes a decision that defines aggressive command. He orders the helmsman to steer directly for the submarine. He isn't going to shoot it. He is going to ram it. He wants to slice the Japanese submarine in half with the steel prow of his destroyer. It's a brutal, primitive tactic, but it's effective. At this speed, the impact would destroy the sub instantly. The crew braces for impact. The men on the deck grab railings. The gunners hold their fire, waiting for the crash. 500 yards. 300 yards. The Japanese sub isn't diving. They haven't seen the O'Bannon yet. The destroyer is coming out of the dark like a ghost. But then, at the very last second, a thought flashes through Commander MacDonald's mind. It's a thought that might have saved his ship, but it doomed him to the strangest battle of the war. He thinks, what if it's a mine layer? The Japanese had submarines specifically designed to lay sea mines. If the Row 34 was carrying mines on its deck, and the O'Bannon rammed it, the resulting explosion wouldn't just sink the sub. It would blow the bow off the destroyer. It was a risk MacDonald couldn't take. "Hard rudder left," he screams. "Hard left." The helmsman spins the wheel. The O'Bannon groans under the G-force. The ship leans heavily to the starboard side, carving a massive turn in the water. The bow swings away from the submarine just seconds before impact. But physics is a cruel mistress. The momentum carries the O'Bannon forward while it turns. The destroyer drifts sideways. Instead of hitting the submarine, the O'Bannon slides right up next to it. The two vessels come to a stop parallel to each other. They are so close that if there was a plank, you could walk from the American destroyer to the Japanese submarine. And this is where the nightmare begins. The Japanese sailors on the deck of the submarine are waking up. They see the towering steel wall of the American ship looming over them. They are confused, terrified, and desperate. They start running toward their deck gun. It's a 3-inch cannon mounted on the submarine's deck. If they can load it, they can fire a shell directly into the O'Bannon's hull at point-blank range. Or worse, into the bridge, killing the command staff. On the O'Bannon, the situation is even worse. Commander MacDonald looks down from the bridge. He screams for his gunners to fire. "Depress the guns. Shoot them." But the gunners report back with the news every captain fears. They can't. The submarine is too close. It is sitting in the water, low to the surface. The O'Bannon's massive 5-inch guns are mounted high on the deck. Even at their lowest angle, they are pointing over the top of the submarine. They are in the dead zone. The most powerful weapons on the ship are useless. The American sailors on the deck are unarmed. They are the deck crew, the loaders, the cooks who ran up to see the action. They don't have rifles. They don't have pistols. They watch as the Japanese sailors reach the 3-inch gun. They watch as the enemy starts to traverse the weapon, swinging the barrel around to point right at them. It takes seconds to aim a deck gun. In 5 seconds, maybe 10, a high-explosive shell is going to tear through them. Panic sets in. Pure animal panic. A sailor looks around for anything to throw. A wrench, a helmet, anything heavy. His eyes land on the wire bins mounted on the bulkhead. The storage lockers. The spud lockers. Without thinking, he reaches in and grabs a handful of raw potatoes. He hurls one at the submarine. It hits the metal hull with a dull thud. Another sailor sees him. He grabs a potato too. Then another. Suddenly, the air is filled with flying vegetables. To the Japanese sailors in the dark, amidst the chaos and the spray of the ocean, they don't see food. They see round, dark objects flying from the American ship. They hear them clanging against the metal deck. And in the terrifying logic of combat, their brains tell them only one thing: grenades. The Americans are throwing hand grenades. The Japanese sailors abandon the deck gun. They scream warnings to each other. They dive for cover. Some try to kick the potatoes off the deck before they explode. Others scramble toward the hatch, trying to get inside the submarine before the blast. For precious seconds, the Japanese crew is paralyzed by the fear of exploding potatoes. This confusion gives Commander MacDonald exactly what he needs: time, distance. He orders the engines to flank speed. He orders the rudder hard right. He needs to pull away, to open up the range just enough to get his guns to bear. The O'Bannon lurches forward, its propellers churning the water, putting distance between the potato-covered submarine and the destroyer. As the distance opens to 100 yards, the Japanese realize their mistake. The grenades aren't exploding. They rush back to the deck gun. But it's too late. The O'Bannon is now far enough away. The 5-inch guns can depress. The angle is good. Fire. The night is ripped apart by the muzzle flash of the American guns. A shell slams into the conning tower of the Row 34. The submarine shudders. It's hurt, but it's not dead. The Japanese captain orders a crash dive. The sub begins to slip beneath the waves, disappearing into the black water. But the O'Bannon isn't done. The Lucky O smells blood. MacDonald orders the ship to turn back. He lines up the stern of the destroyer over the swirling water where the sub just vanished. Drop charges. The depth charges roll off the racks, heavy barrels filled with Torpex explosive. They splash into the water and sink. 1 second. 2 seconds. The ocean erupts. Massive geysers of white water shoot into the air. The shock waves hammer the hull of the O'Bannon. Under the surface, the Row 34 is being hammered by hydraulic pressure. But did they get it? Silence returns to the ocean. The crew of the O'Bannon waits on the deck, staring at the oil-slicked water, chests heaving, adrenaline crashing. Did they sink it? Or is the Row 34 still down there, aligning its torpedo tubes for a revenge shot? This is where the story usually ends in the history books. Destroyer sinks sub with help of potatoes. But the reality of war is rarely that clean. Because the Row 34 didn't die immediately, and the USS O'Bannon had just started a fight that would haunt them until dawn. The ocean is a master of secrets. It swallows sound. It swallows light. And on the morning of April 5, 1943, the crew of the USS O'Bannon prayed it had swallowed the Row 34. Minutes earlier, the water had been churning with the violence of depth charges. Now, the surface was eerily calm. The geysers of white water had settled. The foam was dissipating. On the bridge, Commander MacDonald stood like a statue. His eyes were locked on the dark water off the stern. Every man on the ship was frozen in place. The gunners wiped sweat from their eyes, their fingers hovering over triggers. The sonar operator pressed his headphones so hard against his ears, his knuckles turned white. They were waiting for the sound of breaking metal, the sound of a submarine imploding under the crushing weight of the ocean. But that sound never came. Instead, the sonar operator heard something else, a sound that made his blood run cold. Contact. Moving. The Row 34 wasn't dead. Down in the black depths, the Japanese submarine was hurt, but it was alive. The depth charges had hammered its hull, shattering light bulbs, rupturing hydraulic lines, and throwing men across the compartments. But the pressure hull held. The engines were still turning, and the Japanese captain was not running away. He was angry. He had been humiliated. He had been pelted with vegetables and then blasted with explosives. Now, he was turning his boat around. The hunter had become the hunted, but the hunted still had teeth. On the O'Bannon, the realization hit the crew like a physical blow. The game wasn't over. MacDonald barked orders. Hard right rudder. All engines ahead full. The destroyer heeled over, carving a white scar into the black ocean. They had to find the sub again before it could find them. This is the part of naval warfare that movies rarely show. It isn't just shooting. It's mathematics played for life or death stakes in a pitch-black room. The sonar sends out a ping. It bounces off the steel hull of the enemy. It comes back. Distance, bearing, speed. If you calculate wrong, you drop your depth charges into empty water. If you calculate right, you kill 100 men instantly. But if you take too long to calculate, the submarine fires a torpedo. And at this range, a torpedo doesn't just damage a destroyer, it vaporizes it. The O'Bannon raced back toward the contact point. The sonar pinged faster. The pitch increased. There! The Row 34 was trying to surface again. The damage from the first attack must have been severe. Maybe their ballast tanks were blown. Maybe the air inside was toxic with chlorine gas from cracked batteries. Whatever the reason, the Japanese commander decided that dying on the surface in a gunfight was better than dying in a steel coffin at the bottom of the sea. The dark shape of the submarine broke the surface of the water like a breaching whale. Foam cascaded off its sides. This time, there would be no potatoes. MacDonald didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for the sub to fully stabilize. He didn't wait for them to man their deck gun. Commence firing. The O'Bannon's main battery, 5 massive 5-inch guns, roared in unison. The sound was apocalyptic. The muzzle flashes lit up the night sky for miles, turning the darkness into a flickering strobe light of orange and red. The first salvo bracketed the submarine. Huge pillars of water erupted on either side of the Japanese vessel. The shock waves alone would have been enough to concuss anyone on the deck. The second salvo found its mark. A high-explosive shell slammed into the Row 34's conning tower. Metal shredded like paper. The explosion turned the command center of the submarine into a furnace, but the Japanese submarine kept moving. It was erratic, turning in circles, like a wounded shark snapping at its own tail. MacDonald ordered the O'Bannon to close the distance. He wanted to make sure. He wanted to finish this. The destroyer closed to within 1,000 yards. The anti-aircraft gunners, the men on the 40mm and 20mm cannons, joined the fight. Usually, these guns were used to shoot down nimble Zero fighters, zipping through the clouds. Now they were pouring streams of tracers into a slow-moving steel log in the water. The Row 34 was being disassembled piece by piece. The deck gun was blown off its mount. The periscope shears were twisted into scrap metal. The hull was riddled with holes. And yet, it refused to sink. There is a grim tenacity to the Japanese Imperial Navy that American sailors learned to respect and fear. The concept of surrender did not exist in their doctrine. The Row 34 was burning, leaking, and outgunned, but as long as the propeller turned, it was a threat. MacDonald decided to end it with the sledgehammer. He ordered a collision course, not to ram, but to pass directly over the submarine's position one last time. The O'Bannon thundered toward the burning wreck. As they passed, the stern crew released a full pattern of depth charges. These weren't thrown at a submerged target. These were dropped almost directly onto the surfacing hull. The O'Bannon sped away, bracing for the blast. The ocean behind them lifted up. A massive, singular explosion that tore the night apart. A wall of water and debris shot hundreds of feet into the air. When the water crashed back down, the radar screen was empty. The sonar was silent. The Row 34 was gone. The O'Bannon circled the area until dawn. As the sun rose over the Solomon Islands, turning the gray water into a brilliant blue, the evidence of the night's violence floated to the surface. Oil. A thick, iridescent slick spreading for miles. Debris. Pieces of wood. Insulation. And shattered equipment. There were no survivors. The crew of the O'Bannon gathered on the deck. They were exhausted. Their ears were ringing from the gunfire. Their hands were shaking from the adrenaline crash. They looked at the empty ocean. And then they looked at the spud lockers. The bins were half empty. The potatoes were gone. It started as a whisper among the deck crew, then a chuckle, then the laughter of men who had cheated death. "We sank it with spuds," someone said. "We sank a Japanese sub with a potato." It wasn't technically true. The 5-inch shells and the depth charges had done the sinking. The potatoes had just bought them the 10 seconds of confusion they needed to survive. But in war, the legend is often more powerful than the technicality. When the O'Bannon returned to port, the story didn't just walk off the ship. It sprinted. You have to understand the mood of the United States in 1943. The war was brutal. The newsreels were full of casualty lists, grim maps, and serious men in suits talking about sacrifice. The public was desperate for a win, not just a strategic win, but a human win. Something that showed American ingenuity, something that showed that even when you're out of ammo, out of luck, and staring down the barrel of a gun, an American boy will figure out a way to win. The story of the potato submarine was gold. Naval intelligence tried to keep a lid on it at first. They were worried it made the Japanese look incompetent, which might make American sailors complacent. Or worse, that it made the Navy look bad for sending ships out without enough small arms. But you can't stop a story like that. By the time the O'Bannon reached safe harbor for repairs, the press had caught wind of it. A wire service picked it up, then a radio station, then the newspapers. U.S. destroyer. "Sinks sub with potatoes!" the headlines screamed. Cartoonists drew sketches of sailors winding up like baseball pitchers, throwing potatoes that exploded like grenades. In Maine, the potato farmers went wild. They sent a telegram to the ship. They wanted to buy the crew a drink. They sent shipments of potatoes to the Navy yards. A commemorative plaque was made. It became a joke, a morale booster, a funny anecdote in a terrible war. But for the men who were there, on that dark deck in April, it was never a joke. Years later, Commander MacDonald would give interviews. He would smile politely when asked about the potatoes. He would nod when people laughed, but his eyes would tell a different story. He remembered the smell of the fear. He remembered the sound of the Japanese boots clanging on the metal deck just feet away. He remembered looking into the eyes of the enemy sailors and realizing that they were all going to die in a fireball of twisted metal. The potato wasn't a gag. It was a desperate, primal act of survival. It was a rock thrown by a caveman against a predator. And it worked. But the story of the USS O'Bannon didn't end with the potatoes. If anything, that was just the prologue. Because you don't get a nickname like the Lucky O just for one strange night in the Solomons. The ship seemed to be blessed. Or maybe it was cursed to see everything and survive everything. After the Row 34 incident, the O'Bannon stayed on the front lines. Most ships would rotate out. They would take damage, go to Pearl Harbor for months, and sit out the worst campaigns. Not the O'Bannon. She pushed north. As the American war machine began to hop from island to island, closing the noose around the Japanese Empire, the O'Bannon was the tip of the spear. She fought in the Battle of Kula Gulf, July 1943. Another night battle. Another nightmare in the dark. The Japanese landed reinforcements. The American task force intercepted them. The fighting was confused and vicious at close range. The cruiser USS Helena, a massive warship, was hit by 3 torpedoes. She broke her back and sank within 20 minutes. The O'Bannon was right there. She was firing her guns until the barrels glowed red. She dodged torpedoes that passed so close the crew could hear the propellers whirring underwater. When the smoke cleared, the O'Bannon was untouched. Then came the Battle of Vella La Vella. October 1943. The Japanese attempted to evacuate their troops. The O'Bannon led a force of destroyers to stop them. It was a brawl. Ships colliding, burning, sinking. The destroyer USS Chevalier, sailing right next to the O'Bannon, took a torpedo to the bow. The explosion tore the front of the ship off. The Chevalier lost control and swung directly into the path of the O'Bannon. Collision was inevitable. The O'Bannon slammed into the side of the dying Chevalier. Steel screeched against steel. Men were thrown from their bunks. The O'Bannon's bow was crushed. She was locked together with the sinking ship, a dead weight dragging her down. For 20 minutes, the two ships drifted together, burning, while Japanese planes buzzed overhead and enemy destroyers fired shells at them. The crew of the O'Bannon didn't panic. They launched their boats. They didn't abandon their ship. They boarded the Chevalier. They rescued the survivors of their sister ship, pulling wounded men from the oil and fire, passing them across the twisted metal wreckage. Finally, they managed to break free. The O'Bannon limped away, her nose smashed in, carrying hundreds of survivors. She made it back to port. Again. The shipyard workers looked at the damage and shook their heads. "How is this ship still floating?" they asked. The crew just pointed to the hull number, 450. The lucky O. They patched her up. They welded a new bow on her, and they sent her back out. Because the war was getting worse. The Americans were moving toward the inner ring of Japanese defenses. The Marshall Islands, the Philippines, Iwo Jima. And suddenly, the threat wasn't just submarines or destroyers. The threat was changing. The Japanese were becoming desperate. The logic of survival was being replaced by the logic of sacrifice. The kamikaze were coming, and the O'Bannon, the ship that survived a submarine duel with potatoes, was about to face a storm of steel falling from the sky. This is where the legend moves from lucky to miraculous. By 1944, the Pacific Ocean was filled with the largest armada in human history. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, and hundreds of destroyers. The O'Bannon was part of the screen for the aircraft carriers. Her job was to stand between the high-value targets and the enemy, to be the shield. Radar technology had improved. The O'Bannon was fitted with a combat information center, a dark room full of glowing screens and radio chatter. The crew listened to the voices of the fighter pilots overhead. They heard the frantic calls of "Tally-ho!" and "bandits at 12 o'clock." They watched the sky fill with black puffs of flak. When a kamikaze attack starts, it feels like the wrath of God. You look up, and the sky is raining planes. They don't drop bombs and fly away. They turn into bombs. They dive at terminal velocity, screaming down with the engine at max RPM, aiming for the bridge, the smokestacks, the ammo magazines. Defending against a kamikaze is a math problem with zero margin for error. A plane moving at 300 miles per hour covers a mile every 12 seconds. You have 12 seconds to spot it, track it, aim, fire, and disintegrate it. If you just damage it, it still hits you. If you clip its wing, it cartwheels into you. You have to vaporize it in midair. The O'Bannon's gunners were some of the best in the fleet. They had been shooting at things since 1942. They didn't flinch. Day after day, off the coast of the Philippines, the O'Bannon danced with death. Planes splashed down 50 yards off. The port bow. 100 yards off the starboard beam. Shrapnel rained down on the deck like hail. But the ship was never hit directly. The crew started to believe in their own invincibility. They started to believe that the ship had a soul, that she refused to die. There's a story from the invasion of the Philippines. The O'Bannon was operating close to shore, providing fire support for the troops on the beach. A Japanese shore battery, hidden in a cave, opened fire. Large-caliber shells whistled through the air. Waterspouts erupted all around the O'Bannon. The captain ordered evasive maneuvers. Left, right, speed up, slow down. The shells chased them, closer, closer. One shell landed so close that it splashed water onto the bridge. But it didn't explode. Another shell passed directly between the smokestacks. It didn't touch a wire. The O'Bannon turned her guns on the cave. She fired 5 salvos. The cave collapsed. The battery was silenced. The Lucky O sailed on. But luck is a heavy burden. Because while the ship survives, The men inside her see the cost of that survival. By 1945, the O'Bannon crew had seen more war than any human being should ever see. They had seen the ocean burn. They had seen friends on other ships vanish in flashes of light. They had buried their own at sea. They were tired. Bone tired. The kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. But there was one final act left in the play. One final massive push to the heart of the empire. Okinawa. If the Solomons were hell, Okinawa was the apocalypse. The Japanese had massed everything they had left. Thousands of planes, suicide boats, human torpedoes. The O'Bannon was sent to the radar picket line. This was the most dangerous job in the Navy. The picket destroyers were stationed miles away from the main fleet, alone in the ocean, to act as early warning radar stations. They were the bait. When the kamikaze waves came from Japan, they would see the picket destroyers first, and they would attack them first. To be on a radar picket station at Okinawa was a death sentence. Ships were being sunk daily. Destroyers were being broken in half, blown apart, overwhelmed by swarms of 20 or 30 planes at once. The O'Bannon took her station. Picket Station number 9. The crew checked their life jackets. They checked the rafts. They checked the ammo. And they waited. They thought about the potatoes. They thought about the submarine. That seemed like a lifetime ago. A funny story from a simpler war. Now, there were no potatoes. There was only the sky, and the inevitable black dots appearing on the horizon. But the O'Bannon had one more surprise in store for history. She wasn't just going to survive Okinawa. She was going to become the most decorated ship to ever sail through it. And she was going to do it without taking a single fatal blow. How? Some say it was the captain. Some say it was the radar operators. Some say it was just blind, dumb probability. But the sailors on deck 450 knew better. They knew the ship was watching out for them. Let me tell you about the day the luck was tested the hardest. The day the sky turned black. The radar picket stations at Okinawa were not battlefields. They were slaughterhouses. The Navy called them pickets. The sailors called them floating targets. The O'Bannon was sitting in the middle of a steel typhoon. Every day, the radar screen would fill with the ghosts of the empire. Hundreds of planes, stripped of landing gear, loaded with explosives, flown by pilots who had already written their last letters home. Other ships on the picket line were dying. The USS Bush, the USS Colhoun, the USS Menert El Abeli. Broken, burning, sinking under waves of suicide attacks. But the O'Bannon refused to die. The gunners on deck 450 were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting for the man standing next to them. The barrels of the 40mm Bofors guns were so hot they blistered paint. The decks were buried in a carpet of spent brass casings. There was a moment, in late May 1945, that defined the ship's soul. A group of kamikazes broke through the combat air patrol. They dove on the O'Bannon from 3 different angles. The captain ordered a hard turn. The ship heeled over, the screws chopping the water. The gunners tracked the targets. The first plane was hit by a 5-inch shell. It disintegrated in mid-air, a cloud of fire and aluminum raining down harmlessly into the sea. The second plane came in low, skimming the waves, trying to hit the waterline. The 20mm Oerlikons cut its wing off. It cartwheeled into the ocean, skipping like a stone, and exploded just 50 yards from the hull. The shockwave rattled the ship's teeth, but the hull held. The third plane came straight down, a vertical dive. The gunners couldn't elevate fast enough. The men on the bridge looked up and saw the propeller spinning, the bomb attached to the belly. This was it. The luck had run out. But then the plane shuddered. It missed. It crashed into the water just off the starboard bow. It was so close that water sprayed onto the deck. It was so close that the men could feel the heat of the engine. But it missed. The O'Bannon sailed through the smoke, untouched. By the time the guns fell silent in August 1945, the USS O'Bannon had done the impossible. She had earned 17 battle stars. She had been awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. She had sailed from the Solomons to Tokyo Bay. She had fired thousands of tons of ammunition. She had sunk a submarine. She had fought battleships. She had survived typhoons and suicide planes. And through it all, she had never lost a single man to enemy action. Not one. In a war that consumed 60 million lives, the O'Bannon brought her boys home. When the ship sailed into Tokyo Bay for the formal surrender of Japan, she was sitting alongside the mighty battleships, the USS Missouri and the USS Iowa. The O'Bannon looked small next to them. Her paint was faded. Her hull was dented. She looked like a prize fighter who had gone 15 rounds. But she was the only ship that the other sailors wanted to see. They pointed at her. The Lucky O, the ship that couldn't be sunk. And the story of the potatoes? It didn't disappear. It grew. When the war ended, the story reached the rolling fields of Maine. The Association of Potato Growers of Maine heard about the destroyer that used their harvest as a weapon of war. They were so proud that they had a bronze plaque made. They sent it to the ship. The plaque read, "To the officers and crew of the USS O'Bannon, for their ingenuity in using our product to defeat the Japanese submarine Row 34. It was mounted on the ship near the mess hall, a permanent reminder that in the darkest moment, when technology failed, American grit and a few starchy vegetables saved the day. The O'Bannon served on. She fought in the Korean War. She fought in Vietnam. She sailed for nearly 30 years, but all ships, even the lucky ones, eventually meet their end. In 1970, the O'Bannon was decommissioned. She was sold for scrap. The torches cut into the steel that had deflected Japanese shells. The metal was melted down and recycled. Today, there is no USS O'Bannon sailing the seas. The physical ship is gone. But history is not written in steel. It is written in memory. The Row 34 lies at the bottom of the Pacific, a rusted tomb in the dark water. The men who threw the potatoes are gone now, resting in Arlington or in small-town cemeteries across America. But the lesson of that night remains. War is terrible. It is a machine of industrial slaughter. But inside that machine, there are human beings. Men who get scared, men who make mistakes, and men who, when faced with certain death, will grab a potato and throw it at a submarine because they refuse to give up. It sounds funny. It sounds like a bar story, but it is the most human story of the entire war. It reminds us that courage isn't about having the biggest gun. Courage is about what you do when the gun jams. Do you freeze? Or do you reach into the bin and keep fighting? The crew of the USS O'Bannon didn't freeze. And because of that, they became immortal. If you want to uncover more stories that the history books left out, you are in the right place. This is WW2 Missing Pages. We don't just tell you the dates and the maps. We dig into the archives to find the moments that make you hold your breath. The stories of luck, of horror, and of the impossible odds faced by ordinary men. If this story of the potato submarine blew your mind, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. Don't just watch. Join the battalion. Check out our other videos where we reveal the secrets of the Ghost Army, the pilots who flew without engines, and the soldiers who fought after the surrender. The pages are missing, but we are finding them, one by one. I'll see you in the next. Briefing. Dismissed.